Way to appease the deities, let's give this sadistic sun god a test of his own meta.
Ferdinand von Eyre.
Hi everyone. We finally arrived, the third and final part of this essay. No big scary German words this time, just some musing on Fire Emblem Three Houses and how it fits into the Fire Emblem franchise as a whole. But first, I thought I'd go ahead and tie up some loose ends from part 2, since as I mentioned, there's a section of that video that I inexplicably just forgot to write in. I obviously spent a considerable amount of time discussing the concept of the leitmotif as it relates to motifs and half motifs and other opportunities for motivic development, but there's one other class of motivic behavior I wanted to mention. I couldn't really think of a good name for it, so I'll just call it melodic pairing. Basically, it refers to a melody or some other melodic figure that plays in one track and appears again in another track later on. I hesitate to even call it motivic, since it's usually just one or two other tracks total, but it nonetheless communicates some sort of change from one part of the story to another. There are two examples of this I want to highlight, and keep in mind there could be others that I'm forgetting. The first has to do with the track Land Beloved by the Goddess, which plays at the beginning of each chapter during White Clouds.
Took place under this moon. The people perform music once beloved by those divine beings. Whether by harp, by flute, or voice alone, joyous melodies are shared between farmers as they sow their seeds across the vast plains of Tailtean and Gronder.
If you pay close attention, you'll notice that it shares its melodic contour with the track Three Crowns, which plays at the beginning of each chapter after the time skip. And again in the track Still Horizon after you beat the game, right before the S-Support conversation, the character montage, and the credits.
A rising flame was alight as the flow of time carved a new history for Fodlan. Rhea's wild rampage was put to an end, averting what could have been the greatest crisis in the history of Fodlan. After 5.5 years of war, a new age was set.
The connection between these tracks doesn't bear any grandiose significance story-wise, but it does provide an aesthetic backdrop to each phase of the story. It's optimistic during White Clouds, intense during the war, and relieved at the end of the game. The other example is the medley that plays during the post-game character montage, A Blaze in the Northern Sky, A Star in the Morning Sky. There we go. This track includes melodic figures from multiple previous tracks, including The Long Road, Fodlan Winds, Tearing Through Heaven, and of course the main theme for the Fire Emblem series. Now, the presence of an ending medley is a common fixture in many forms of media, from movies to music and so on, typically serving the purpose of giving the observer one last overview of everything that happened throughout the story. In the case of A Star in the Morning Sky, most of this overviewing comes in the form of battle themes, musically reflecting upon everything the player went through to get to the end of the game. All that war and all that struggle is finally over. And then, once those melodies play, the main Fire Emblem theme comes in to wrap a bow on it. Alright, now that that's out of the way, let's get into the meat of Part 3. Sometime before I had the idea to start this whole essay, I made it a goal for the year 2021 to play through all the mainline Fire Emblem games that I hadn't played yet, and though it took me a while, I did it. Go me. If you're interested in knowing the order I played them in, here's the list. The point of me playing through the whole series, especially once I started this essay, wasn't just to say that I've played them all, I mean of course I wanted to do that too, but also because I figured I'd eventually want to explore how they all relate to one another, particularly to Three Houses. After all, why talk about Three Houses in terms of total artwork if you're not going to discuss how it fits within the totality of its own series? So I played them. I played them all. And what did I discover after playing them all? Well, not quite as much as I expected. But definitely not nothing. There's actually quite a bit I want to discuss here on how each game of the series influenced Three Houses, especially the 3DS games. But since I know that many of you would still like me to talk about connections between Three Houses and the pre-3DS titles too, and let's be real, so do I, I'll go ahead and discuss those here, and I'll include Shadows of Valentia as well since it's a remake of FE2. Quick warning, I will be discussing some spoilers for basically the whole series. And one last thing before I dive in, I'd like to give a quick shout out to Reddit user Jay Biesenberg for helping me brainstorm for this section. Alright, here we go. Fire Emblem 1, of course, introduced the basic gameplay mechanics for the series, including grid-based maps, turn-based combat, stat-boosting items, class promotion, and so on, which remain not only in Three Houses but also in every other game of the series. Gaiden introduced the option to play the game on Paragon mode, which may have influenced the double weapon experience feature from the Saint statues in Three Houses. Both games also have a somewhat limited cast, particularly in the late game. Additionally, the villager units in Gaiden, much like the students in Three Houses, start in generic classes, allowing the player to decide which class path to go down. Gaiden's remake, Shadows of Valentia, introduced combat arts for specific weapons, which expanded into combat arts for weapons, classes, and skill levels in Three Houses. And of course, the Milla's turnwheel mechanic made a return in Three Houses in the form of Divine Pulse. Mystery of the Emblem surprisingly doesn't add much that wasn't already present in Fire Emblem 1 and Fire Emblem 2, aside from the Dancer class and the option for mounted units to dismount. In contrast, Genealogy of the Holy War provides the most clear-cut, obvious influences on Three Houses out of all the early Fire Emblem titles. For one thing, there's a multi-year time skip that happens about halfway through the story that, without spoilers, completely changes the trajectory of the story. Additionally, Genealogy introduces personal skills, the ability to repair weapons, the Kanto ability for mounted units, the receiving of extra cash at the end of chapters, and the first version of the Fire Emblem support system. And of course, the Holy Blood mechanic, including the holy weapons, are clearly analogous to crests and the Hero's Relics. Speaking of the Hero's Relics, the lore surrounding Sothis bears similarity to Genealogy's lore surrounding the Divine Dragon Naga. It's not a complete one-to-one comparison though, and major spoilers for Three Houses in 3, 2, 1. While Naga blesses the Crusaders with the holy weapons and holy blood in Genealogy, Three Houses flips that on its head by also having the crests and hero's relics come from the goddess, except that Nemesis and his crew actually obtain them by slaughtering the goddess and her children. With that lovely image, we move on to Thracia 776, where the influences on Three Houses aren't nearly as obvious, particularly when it comes to traits either introduced by or are exclusive to it. But the aforementioned Jay Biesenberg pointed out to me that Dimitri's story in Azure Moon bears remarkable similarity to Leif's story in Thracia. I'll quote them directly since they say it better than I ever could. Azure Moon Dimitri has some interesting parallels to Leif. In a way, Dimitri is an attempt at a possible look into what could have happened to Leif if Finn wasn't around. Both are princes who lose their families in bloody massacres, lose their homes and kingdoms to an invading empire that allied with a dangerous and shadowy group, are forced into exile and hunted down. A lot of the people around them do the heavy lifting until a crucial advisor dies due to their recklessness, forcing them to reevaluate how they've approached their respective wars and take a more hands-on approach, etc. Of course, where Dimitri is isolated for 5 years and becomes deranged, Leif has the guiding hand of Finn to keep him centered. They even have sisters who were taken from them by the enemy at a young age to be raised into that enemy's way of thinking, who appear as antagonists, Edelgard and Altina. Of course, they both ultimately play very different roles in each game. Couldn't have said it better. Thanks again. Moving on to the GBA titles, the Binding Blade and the Blazing Sword not only introduce the ability to swap unit placement at the beginning of each map without having to manually change the order of your units in the deployment screen, but also feature the legendary weapons which are both powerful and serve a role in the plot. Heck, you can't even experience the true ending of FE6 unless you obtain them all and haven't used them up. The Sacred Stones features branching promotion, albeit not as comprehensively as Three Houses, and also has optional opportunities for grinding, though I suppose Gaiden technically had that too. The Tellius games, like Verdant Wind, directly address the topic of racism, and like Azure Moon and Crimson Flower, they address classism as well, though classism also appears in earlier games. Gameplay-wise, these are the first games in which the player gets to assign individual abilities to their units, and also grants the player the ability to forge weapons. Story-wise, the way that Edelgard and Lysithea receive Second Crest bears remarkable similarity to the scene in Path of Radiance where Ike, Ranulf and company go to the basement of Gritnia Tower to find the corpses of the feral Laguz, and Aina explains that these grotesque figures were the result of experiments performed on the Laguz to give them extreme levels of power in exchange for a shorter lifespan. Shadow Dragon and New Mystery of the Emblem both featured wider reclassing options than prior games, and they each provided the option of playing at a ridiculously high level of difficulty. New Mystery of the Emblem also introduced a customizable avatar for the first time, not including Mark from FE7, as well as the option to play on casual mode, which has appeared in every Fire Emblem game since as an option for players who don't want to worry about permadeath. Now, in addition to all that I've mentioned so far, there are some influences on Three Houses that appear in multiple of these titles, and in some cases, all of them. For example, the lore surrounding the various races of dragons remains mostly consistent, namely in that dragons go mad if they spend too much time in their dragon form, similar to what happens to Rhea in Silver Snow, as well as Medius in the Arcanea games and the dragons in Alib. Because of this, dragons make use of special dragon stones to contain their bestial power, taking on the form of a human when they aren't using their dragon form. Think of Tiki, Fa, or Myrrh, and to an extent the various races of Laguz. Some dragons even choose to throw away their dragonstone in order to remain in their human form for their whole lives, like Bantu did. This in particular likely influenced how Seteth and Flayn are no longer able to take on their respective bestial forms. Another feature of the series that appears in Three Houses is something I alluded to in part 2 of this essay, which is the idea that conflict is often cyclical. We get a taste of this right at the beginning of the series where although you defeat Garneth and Medius at the end of FE1, they both return in FE3 and you must defeat them again. Shadows of Valentia expands on this idea in its post-game. Keep in mind this is in the time between FE1 and FE3, where Alm, Celica, and company travel to Thebes and defeat the Creation, a false dragon that was created when the alchemist Fornius experimented with the blood of a divine dragon. Ironically, it's the defeat of the Creation that sets its spirit free, which after 2,000 years results in the main conflict of Fire Emblem Awakening. More on that in just a bit. Plus, the very premise of Radiant Dawn also portrays cyclical conflict, namely in that Tellius did not return to peace after Ike, Alencia, and company won the war against Daein in Path of Radiance. These ideas are carried over into Three Houses, albeit loosely, both in the return of the once defeated Nemesis in Verdant Wind, and in the death of Edelgard in Verdant Wind and Silver Snow, where she says,
"Even now, across this land, people are killing each other. If you do not act now, this conflict will go on forever."
Edelgard seems to maintain a certain awareness of this in Azure Moon as well, most notably in the scene where she and Dimitri meet to attempt to negotiate a peaceful end to the conflict. She tells him that this war is the only way she thinks Fodlan's cycle of violence can end. Moving on, classism also recurs as a theme, or at least a feature, in many Fire Emblem titles, both before and after the 3DS. A few examples here include the relationship between Clarine and Rutger in FE6, Claire and Gray in Shadows of Valentia, and Maribel's relationship to various members of your party in Awakening. Examples like these typically feature nobles unknowingly or intentionally looking down on commoners early on in the game, eventually learning to treat them with respect by the end. We see this in abundance in Three Houses, from Ferdinand and Lawrence's ramblings about noble duty, Dorothea and Leonie's distaste for nobility, and so on. A few other examples of classism in Fire Emblem include Ike's relationship with Soniki and the other higher-ups of Benyon in Path of Radiance, and Leif being completely unaware of commoner struggles in FE5, namely in how the lack of food and economic opportunity in South Thracia leads to more widespread banditry throughout the region. Also throughout the series, the Fire Emblem is an actual, tangible object with plot importance. There's the shield in the Arcanea games and in Awakening, the Veltomer family crest in the Yggdrasil games, the Imperial Seal of Bern in the Alib games, Grotto's Gemstone in the Sacred Stones, the Medallion in the Tellius games, and the Omega Yato in Fates, leading all the way up to the Crest of Flames being Three Houses Fire Emblem. In fact, out of the entire series, the Fire Emblem is only missing in Gaiden and its remake Shadows of Valentia. Someone please correct me in the comments if there actually is one and I missed it. Three Houses also follows an art style in the vein of anime of the day, much like the rest of the series. That's right, it didn't just all of a sudden become anime in the 3DS era. But speaking of the 3DS era, it's finally time to talk about Awakening, because it's here that the series' influences on Three Houses really start to come into focus. Now, I'm not gonna lie, when I was editing part 2 of this video essay, I low-key got a little emotional when I put the title screen track from Awakening in the section about the Crest of Flames theme. It was one part nostalgia and one part awareness of the fact that we wouldn't be here talking about Three Houses if it weren't for the success of Awakening. Now, I won't go into the whole story of how Awakening saved the Fire Emblem series here, since there are plenty of other YouTubers who have told that story better than I ever could. But I think it's worth a brief overview, because it will help us grasp how this game from 2012 served as both the end and the beginning of two different eras of Fire Emblem. Essentially, due to lackluster sales of Fire Emblem games in the years leading up to Awakening, Nintendo threatened to pull the plug on the series if Awakening didn't reach 250,000 copies sold. Knowing that this could very well be the last game in the series, the developers took the approach of incorporating as many elements from prior games as possible into Awakening as a way to celebrate everything the series had accomplished up to that point. Some examples of this include the game taking place in the former lands of Arcanea and Valentia, the ability to freely move throughout the overworld map like in Gaiden and Sacred Stones, Chrom and the rest of the Elise royal family being direct descendants of Marth, and ancient weapons of earlier Fire Emblem lords being scattered randomly throughout the game.
But they didn't just make a new, old game.
They also added a lot of new features to widen the game's appeal. Of course, there's the expanded support and romance system, making it more comprehensive than any prior support system in the series, and the inclusion of voice acting helped bring life to the characters like never before, even if its inclusion was limited to a few short phrases at a time. Now here is where some of you may be expecting me to bring up the series' increase of sex appeal, you know, the whole waifu emblem meme. However, while Awakening certainly opened the door for more fan service in the series, love and sexuality have always played a part in one way or another in just about every game of the series. Let's do a quick rundown for those who don't believe me, shall we? There's the bit at the end of FE1 in its remake where Marth has to confront his feelings and ask Seda to accompany him back to Altea, and they get married at the end of FE3 in its remake. The ending of FE1 is also reflected at the end of FE5 when Leif and Nana get together, and that game also has a section in Chapter 8X where the dialogue insinuates that Dagdar likes Avel. But back to FE3, one of the key plot points is how Hardin descends into grief due to his unrequited love for Nina, opening the way for him to be possessed by the Dark Stone, with a similar thing happening to Leon in FE8. Speaking of FE8, the whole character and personality of Tethys oozes sexuality, particularly in her support conversations. Oh, and let's not forget that the whole plot of FE4 hinges on Sigurd getting the hots for Deirdre, and the whole trajectory of FE2's story arcs toward Alm and Celica getting together in the end, which only gets further accentuated in its remake. In FE6 you can play matchmaker with Roy, and I'm pretty sure everyone had a crush on Lynn back when FE7 came out. Additionally, the Tellius games have become something of an icon for LGBT Fire Emblem fans. With some pretty sexual undertones in some of the in-game text, particularly between certain characters of the same sex. I've barely scratched the tip of this iceberg, but I hope that clears some things up. Anyways, as I mentioned, Awakening included voice acting for the first time in the series, which was further implemented in Fates, eventually being fully realized in Shadows of Valentia and Three Houses. Awakening also introduced the pair-up system, which, while not in Three Houses, likely influenced what would become the adjutant system. Awakening also further expanded options for reclassing with the introduction of the second seal, providing more options than ever before for unit customization. Oh, and remember when I mentioned how conflict in Fire Emblem is often cyclical? Awakening basically rubs this idea in your face in the endgame, telling you that if you allow Chrom to land the final blow on Grima instead of Robin, Grima will eventually return, meaning that the very conflict you just spent this whole game waging would just repeat itself a few generations down the line. Now, I could keep going on these things, but we'd be here forever. I just bring all this up to say, just as Awakening served as a culmination of all the games that went before it, it also laid the groundwork for the games that came after. And with that, we get to Fates. Ah yes, Fates. The sophomore slump of the 3DS era, as many fans would call it. If you've spent any amount of time in the Fire Emblem community, you've undoubtedly heard at least a few people call these games the worst in the series. I personally think that's a little harsh, since there's really quite a lot to like in these games, but in order to talk about how they connect to Three Houses, then yes, I too need to air out some of Fates' dirty laundry. But I promise there is a purpose to it, and we'll get to that purpose soon enough. I'll start with Fates' world building, or rather, geography building. Now I want you to take a good look at this map of Fodlan for a second. You see the national borders, you see where the major cities are, and you can see other geographic and geological features of the continent. And like any good map, you can probably piece together some of the geopolitical dynamics at work between each nation just by looking at it, even if you haven't played the game. You got that? Okay, now let's take a look at the two Fates maps. What are you even supposed to look at here? Where are the national borders? Where are the capital cities? I guess we have some topography, but what else? They tell you in-game that Hoshido is over here, and Nor is over here, and this map is supposed to be of Vala, but many other nations are mentioned throughout the game, many of which your party visits at different points of the story, and we can't even really see where those places are. They don't even give you a name for the main continent, and it's been up to the fans to fill in the gaps on labels and such. Isn't that supposed to be the writers' and developers' responsibility? But enough about maps. How boring. Let's talk about the story. All three routes seem hastily thrown together, like the developers were in a hurry to get this thing out before a strict deadline. Granted, in my research for this section, I had a difficult time finding any concrete info to support that claim, but from what I can tell by what I did manage to find, they seemed to bite off more than they could chew. And it's a bummer because the story was clearly created with a lot of passion behind it. But alas, passion alone does not a good story make, so I'll give a few examples as to where I feel the story fell short, whether it felt rushed or it otherwise felt like they made poor decisions story-wise. I don't want to dwell on these for too long, so I'll just list a few that come off the top of my head. In Birthright, we have the pointless death of Flora and the scene where Leo conveniently shows up with a tome that can teleport Corrin and company to the Rainbow Sage. In Conquest, the death of the Rainbow Sage comes off as unnecessary, and why is it that Azura's orb, which shows Garen's true self, can only be used in Vala? And somehow we simply just trust that everything behind Garen will be revealed once he sits on the Hoshidan throne? And this is guaranteed to work? Birthright and Conquest share a few story beats, like how Takumi and Elise both fall ill to the mysterious local disease, and how somehow no one can tell it's Azura performing in the opera house. Side note, was she already programmed to perform? Was she a last minute addition to the bill? Or did she just randomly go on stage? I'm pretty sure she would have been dragged off if that were the case. My experience as a musician says that everything here is just wrong. Also, the whole idea of grey morality in these games goes right out the window from the get-go when we see the way Garen's character is set up. We see the flashback of him murdering Sumeragi and kidnapping Corrin, and he openly says that he intentionally had Corrin sent to Hoshido so the sword he gave Corrin can turn on them and kill Mikoto. He even goes on to show disappointment that Corrin came back alive when he returned to Nor at the beginning of Conquest. Like, what? And then we get to Revelation. The most obvious thing here is the first rule of Vala is, you do not talk about Vala thing. Plus, how in the world would anyone in their right mind willingly jump into the bottomless canyon? And the whole arc with Anthony is just kinda there, and the whole scene where Gunter is shown to be the traitor comes off as your basic he said she said drama. But okay, enough of those, let's address the characters. Most of these characters have been memed to death at this point as one-dimensional, gimmicky, and lacking any depth. Hana likes to train, Niles is flirty, Effie likes to eat, Harry likes to kill, Leo is smart, Mitoma likes poetry and sleeping, Azura sings and dances and is mysterious, Takumi is distrustful, Felicia is clumsy, Garen and his goons are bloodthirsty monsters that care nothing for human lives. The list goes on. And of course, since we're talking about characters, we also have to talk about Corrin. Now this especially has been talked to death, but Corrin's character is a classic case of a self-insert gone awry. The big thing here for me is that despite having the whole story revolve around them, Corrin has very little agency in the narrative, contrary to what you would expect from a player avatar. In fact, the only real choice Corrin can make in the story really has less to do with himself and more to do with which game you picked up at GameStop, because if you didn't also buy the other game, and if you didn't download Revelation, you can't even choose to play the other routes. And it's really a bummer because I actually don't mind most of the character traits they gave Corrin. You know, the sheltered, naive, kind-hearted, and idealistic prince/princess that's trying to stop the war between their two families. It's just written so haphazardly. Corrin's basically going,
"Guys, no, stop!"
the whole time, and the story just kind of happens around them. Sometimes I actually wonder if it was a mistake to have fate center around a self-insert. Of course, I could raise a similar question about Awakening and Three Houses, but Robin and Byleth serve very different purposes in their respective games than Corrin does in Fates. They're both significant to the plot, but they themselves are not the center of their stories. Think about it. In Awakening, while Robin ends up being the embodiment of the Big Bad Grima, the story really centers around Crom and Lucina's mission to keep the tragic events of Lucina's timeline from occurring. Similarly, while Byleth is a major catalyst for the events of Three Houses, bearing the crest of flames, carrying the consciousness of Sothis, etc., the real main characters of each route respectively are Dimitri, Edelgard, Claude, and Rhea. In other words, Azure Moon is the character study of Dimitri, more on that in a bit, Crimson Flower is the story of Edelgard's struggle, Verdant Wind is the story of Claude teasing out the secrets of Fodlan's history, and Silver Snow is the story of Rhea's tragic decline. At times, it even seems like Byleth is just along for the ride, particularly post-time skip. Keep in mind, I obviously don't think that these are the only ways you utilize a self-insert. These are just the two examples from the series that I think were the most effective.
Alright, I know I just got done tearing into Karin and Fates as a whole.
But again, I don't want to make it sound like I hate these games. I really don't. I legitimately enjoy them, and I highly recommend you all play them at some point if you haven't already. I still return to them semi-regularly, particularly Revelation. I love the wide array of options when it comes to team building, as well as the whole airy, ethereal aesthetic of Vala, and yes, I even have a soft spot for some of the map gimmicks. Oh, and let's not forget that Revelation's endgame is one of the best in the whole series. I mean, come on, how do you not get hyped from End of All? I also love the Fates pair-up system, which is something from these games I legitimately missed when playing Three Houses for my first time. I personally prefer pair-ups over adjutants. I always enjoy trying out new romantic pairings for child units, and with each playthrough, I learn more and more about the truly intricate classing system, especially with the DLC classes. And of course, the soundtrack is fantastic as well. So if I really do enjoy these games, then why did I just rip into them for so long? Well, it's to assert something about the relationship between Fates and Three Houses that I think is important, and that assertion is, Fire Emblem Three Houses is the fulfillment of Fire Emblem Fates. What do I mean by this? What I mean is this: where Fates fell short, Three Houses tried again and improved. In other words, Three Houses isn't just a great standalone game, it's a symbol of the sheer amount of growth the writers and developers underwent in the years between the two titles. I feel I should also give an honorable mention to Shadows of Valentia because it too was an improvement of Fire Emblem storytelling, both from Fates and from Gaiden. I've also heard this sentiment said another way: Fates walked so Three Houses could run. And thank goodness for that, because the developers easily could have gone, well, that didn't work, and scrapped everything that went wrong with Fates like the developers of some series tend to do. But no, they picked up the pieces, tried again, and improved, and I think that that's something we should all take a moment to appreciate. And it didn't take long for me to notice these improvements as I played through each route of Three Houses for my first time. In fact, I often found myself thinking things like, hey, that's what they were trying to do with Fates, and wouldn't you know it, they mostly made it work this time. Like how White Cloud succeeded in setting up an actual morally ambiguous plot. As I mentioned in part 1 of this essay, depending on how you look at it, there's just as much reason to side with Edelgard as there is to side with Rhea, unlike how Garen is painted as a sole villain from the get-go, giving very little moral reason to side with Nor. And when it came to the post-time skip routes, I also found that the 4 routes in Three Houses are improved versions of the 3 routes of Fates. Think about it. Much like how Birthright and Conquest cover the binary conflict between Hoshido and Nor, Azure Moon and Crimson Flower cover the binary conflict between Edelgard and the Kingdom in Church, with Azure Moon sharing a similar premise to Birthright, i.e. opposing Norian and Adrestian aggression, and Crimson Flower sharing a similar premise to Conquest, i.e. being on the offensive. In similar fashion, Revelation pairs with Verdant Wind and Silver Snow in that those stories attempt to subvert the binary conflict to seek out what's really going on behind the scenes. But beyond mere paralleling, Three Houses also improves on the themes presented in Fates. Let's take trauma, for example, since I discussed it briefly at the end of part 2 of this essay. How do the Fates characters handle trauma? Well, we have Hinoka, who became a knight in order to get Corrin back after their kidnapping, and Silas basically does the same thing when the Norians cut off his friendship with Corrin. We have Kaze, who experiences guilt for not preventing the death of Sumeragi and the kidnapping of Corrin, so he pledges not to serve anyone until he can serve Corrin. Okay, not bad so far. We have Camilla, who spent her childhood being a mere political pawn for her mother, causing her to develop something akin to a mother complex, becoming extremely protective and even possessive over those she cares about, particularly towards Corrin. Even examples like Obero hating Nor because they killed her parents, and Perry becoming obsessed with murder after the death of her mother are simple, but mostly effective. Really, there aren't too many problems here, except for one little thing. I actually had to do quite a bit of research to remember any of those. Seriously, despite the sheer number of times I've played each of the Fates games, I couldn't recall hardly any of this. You really have to dig deep into the supports to learn about many of the characters' backstories, which, remember, not everyone is going to do. And when you do read them, these traits, again, come across as contrived and sometimes downright arbitrary. Plus, since most of these examples revolve around each character's relationship to Corrin, it comes across that these characters have little else going on in their lives aside from serving the self-insert. Now let's compare that to Three Houses' handling of trauma. Actually, I'll do you one better and compare it to examples from just one of the houses. So, here's how the Blue Lions address the topic of trauma. The big one, of course, is Dimitri, who witnessed the loss of his whole family in the tragedy of Duscur, as well as the subsequent massacre of the people of Duscur by Fargus. He manages to keep a collected appearance for a while afterward, but internally he develops a deep bloodlust toward those responsible for the event, which eventually boils over when he finds out that Edelgard is the Flame Emperor. Dudu likewise witnessed the massacre of his people, but upon seeing Dimitri step in to protect him, he devotes his entire life to serving the prince, hoping to one day mend the broken relationship between Duscur and Fargus. Another life lost in the tragedy of Duscur was Glenn of House Fraldarius, and given Glenn's characterization as the ideal knight, one can easily imagine the impact his loss would have on Felix, his brother, and Ingrid, his fiancée. But what's interesting here is the two widely divergent paths Felix and Ingrid take in dealing with that loss. Ingrid devotes herself to embodying the perfect chivalric image she saw in Glenn, whereas Felix becomes absolutely disillusioned with the whole idea of chivalry, particularly when his father, upon seeing Glenn's body, merely said, "He died like a true knight." He openly and quite aggressively calls out Dimitri's inner barbaric self, as well as the flaws of his other allies, even to the point of mistreating those he cares about. I'll mention Gilbert here too, because you need to understand his trauma before I describe Annette's. Gilbert, aka Gustav, managed to save Dimitri's life during the tragedy of Duscur, but he still felt extreme guilt for not fulfilling his knightly duty and giving his own life to save Dimitri's father, King Lambert. In his shame, he decides to abandon his home and family to move to Garreg Mach, where he takes on the name Gilbert and becomes a Knight of Seiros, spending much of his time at the monastery in prayer for the forgiveness of his sins. Of course, Gilbert abandoning his home caused a great deal of emotional pain for his daughter Annette, who channels her pain into studying as hard as she can to get accepted to the Officers' Academy. Once there, she could track down Gilbert and try to convince him to come home, which we see play out in their support conversations. Sylvain witnesses the dark side of the crest and nobility system at a young age when his family disowns his brother Miklon merely for not having a crest. From this experience, Sylvain internalizes that his value in the family lies solely in his possession of a crest and his ability to pass it down the family bloodline. In response, he develops the habit of sleeping around, hoping to at least have some fun before being forced into a marriage that he likely won't have much agency in choosing. Additionally, he has to live through the death of Miklon during White Clouds, reinforcing his already complicated feelings about his family and Fargus society as a whole. Mercedes was separated from her brother Emile as a child, and not just that, she doesn't completely understand why he didn't escape their home with her and their mother. To fill the brother-sized hole in her heart, she chooses to serve the church and tries to be the perfect big sister to everyone around her. In fact, it's not unless and until you play Crimson Flower, not Azure Moon, that she can reunite with her brother and find closure concerning the circumstances surrounding their separation. Even Ash gets a few moments in the spotlight here, and actually the game does you one better and lets you experience it in real time as Rhea sends you in your house to kill Lord Lonato, Ash's adoptive father. A couple of chapters later, you see Ash piece together that Lonato is actually used by those who slither in the dark, and you actually get to see the goodest boy get a little mad at the realization. Like Ingrid, he also channels his loss into trying to embody the ideal knight that he saw both in Lonato and in the books he read about King Lugh. And again, I'll reiterate, this is all in just one of the three houses. In the case of Three Houses, it helps that unlike Fates, most of these traumas actually play a role in the plot and aren't inserted merely to fill out a character trait. Plus, in many of these Blue Lions examples, we even get to catch glimpses of how each character works at overcoming their trauma. Ash tags along with Catherine in their paralogue to find closure on Lonato's death, and during the non-Azure Moon routes, he goes back to represent Lonato's house during the war. Dudu refuses to call himself a friend of Dimitri until Dimitri really does put in the work to mend the relationship between Fargus and Duscur, even when Dimitri insists that Dudu call himself a friend and not just a vassal. We get to see Annette and Gilbert talk through their feelings and their support conversations and how they end up deciding to go back home together after the war. Heck, the entire arc of Azure Moon covers how Dimitri, with the help of Byleth, overcomes his bloodlust towards Edelgard, to the point where he even tries reconciling with her at the end. His pain from the tragedy of Duscur isn't gone, but he's learned to live with that, and grows into his role as king. Really, it's Fire Emblem's greatest character study. Now, going back to the topic of grey morality, Three Houses also found ways to grow from Fates' handling of moral ambiguity beyond the premise itself. In Crimson Flower in particular, we see people from both sides of the war question the actions of their respective sides. For example, we see Edelgard openly question whether or not her path is the correct one, and in the endgame we see Catherine openly oppose Rhea's command to burn Ferdiad, and if memory serves me right, it's the only time in the whole game that any of Rhea's underlings dare to challenge her. Also in Azure Moon, part of the whole Dimitri character study involves the rest of the Blue Lions having to sort through how, or if, to serve their soon-to-be king in lieu of his bloodthirsty demands. And in Verdant Wind, Claude's whole character is set up around moral ambiguity, from his secrecy to his schemes and such. Oh, and all of that is without me even mentioning the Ashen Wolves. Additionally, prejudice, particularly classism, is treated with a lot more nuance than I would have expected from a video game. It would have been easy enough to just have the commoners call the nobles bad and call it a day. Heck, that's probably what I would have done. But instead, we get to see the nobility have occasional moments in the spotlight, like when Lawrence corrects Leone in her assertion that his family did nothing for her village, which is in Gloucester territory. And beyond mere morality, the emotional beats of Three Houses pack a bigger punch than anything in Fates. I always get hyped from the Awakening cutscene in the Sealed Forest, and I share Dimitri's horror at the death of Rodrigue in Azure Moon, as well as the following sorrow of the scene with him and Byleth in the rain. And of course, I find the scene in Crimson Flower where Dedue turns himself into a demonic beast to be one of the most terrifying moments in the whole series. Of course, all of this isn't to say that the story and thematic development in Three Houses is perfect. Each route certainly has its flaws. Crimson Flower was clearly rushed, Talus just unceremoniously dies in Azure Moon, and why is it Claude and not Rhea that defeats Nemesis once and for all? And why does Rhea just not show up at the end of Azure Moon when characters are constantly mentioning how they're worried for her? And why do we not get to fight those who slither in the dark directly in Crimson Flower? And why do Edelgard and Hubert not know the location of Shambhala if they're working so closely with Talus and company? And although I praised the way Three Houses handled the topic of prejudice, I was still kinda disappointed with certain aspects of it, particularly how Verdant Wind handled it. I mean, Claude talks about breaking down the walls between peoples constantly, but we don't get to see much of that actually happening aside from the part where the Almiran army shows up at Fort Merceus. I also low-key found myself doing some headcanon shenanigans when playing Silver Snow, and was also kinda disappointed that Verdant Wind and Silver Snow were basically the same story until the last chapter. Even smaller moments like Byleth telling Rhea, "You can't stop me," before the chapter at the Sealed Forest fell flat for me. But again, these flaws don't take a single thing away from the other, greater accomplishments of this game. And like the flaws of Fates, they show opportunities for further growth in future titles. And speaking of future titles, it's time to move on to the last section of this video. This section is gonna age like milk, isn't it? Alright, time for me to play fortune teller and ask what we can expect from Fire Emblem going into the future. As I'm writing this, the Nintendo Direct from this February has already happened, meaning I already know that the new Fire Emblem Warriors game is coming, so I won't do much speculating there and instead focus on future mainline games, potentially remakes too. I won't be predicting anything specific like what the plot of the next game will be or anything like that, though I think it's a pretty safe bet to guess that the main character will have blue hair and their father will die either before or early on in the campaign. Instead, I'll discuss general traits that we've seen throughout the series that I think will be expanded on in future titles. First and foremost, I think the writers and developers will continue to improve on their ability to tell stories on the scale we've seen in both Fates and Three Houses, and given the success of Three Houses, I wouldn't be surprised if they use the branching path mechanic again. If they do, I'd hope they do it all in one cartridge again instead of selling two separate ones and a third that's download only. Oh, and speaking of, quick PSA, don't forget to download Revelation and all your DLC while you still can. And paired with the story, I think it's fair to expect that the characters will continue to take center stage in progressing the plot. I know this sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised how often writers forget that it's usually more effective to have characters drive the plot, and not the other way around. Supports will obviously make a return too, perhaps even more comprehensively than Three Houses, if that's even possible. Thematically, I'd expect future titles to lean further into the topic of perspective, which is a theme of Three Houses that I didn't discuss nearly enough. And actually, the idea of perspective seems to have been trending in video games for quite a while now, and as we've seen, Fire Emblem can be a good vehicle for exploring the nuances of conflict, so why not? Gameplay-wise, I think future titles will retain most of the features that the series has held since the beginning, grid-based maps, class promotion, and so on. I definitely expect that there will be some carryover from Three Houses, particularly when it comes to combat arts and gambits, maybe demonic beasts or something akin to them as well. As we saw, those features added a fresh, new layer of strategic depth to the player's experience in Three Houses, so I'd expect them to continue down that path whether they expand on what's already there or they add new features entirely. I could also see monastery roaming coming back, depending on the game. It would especially be fitting for a Genealogy of the Holy War remake, but it could easily make sense in a new mainline game too, even if they pare it down as something like the My Castle feature of Fates. Or they could have an Awakening/Sacred Stones style map where you can freely move from one place to another. Now, will any of these predictions be right? Who knows? Are they so vague that they come off as Nostradamus prophecies? Yeah, probably. None of these are very bold, are they? Probably should have thought that through before writing this section. But it's still fun to speculate, and we fans will probably keep doing just that until the next game finally gets announced. But alas, it's about time for me to wrap up this video, and in doing so finally finish this essay that I've spent more than a year on. But first, I'd like to give a few shoutouts. First and foremost, I'd like to shout out my IRL friends and family who have supported me throughout this process. You all know who you are. Your feedback has been invaluable, and your encouragement even more so. Among these IRL friends is fellow content creator TJ the Emperor, whom I bounced ideas off of a few times when writing the scripts for these videos. Each of you should definitely check out his channel too. He's got some great content, including a series on gaming in the Clinton years, and another series he recently started on Xenosaga. Also, I'd like to shout out another fellow YouTuber, V the Pizza Boy, who gave me the kick in the pants I needed to actually start working on this project. For those looking to get into content creation, I'll happily pass on the advice V once gave me, which is to simply go for it, even if you have no idea what you're doing. You'll learn as you go, and you can always find help online if you need. Additionally, I'd like to once again give a big shout out and thank you to Jay Biesenberg for helping me brainstorm for the Thracia 776 section of this video. And of course, one last shout out to all of you watching this big ol' essay, whether you've been following along from the beginning or if you just stumbled upon it today. It really does mean a lot to have people like you listen to my thoughts, long-winded as they can be sometimes. It means more than you know. And there we have it. Fire Emblem Three Houses as 21st century Gesamtkunstwerk. Is it a perfect game? Perhaps not. In fact, I might make a video one of these days discussing things I think they could have done differently with the story. Actually, you know what? Screw it. If I ever make another big series like this, it'll be me spitballing ideas for story rewrites on each route. But nonetheless, this game truly is a piece of total artwork. From the story, to the setting, to the characters, it's such a wonderful world to dive into, and I'll likely find myself doing just that again and again and again. So with that, stay tuned, I'll see you soon, and I just lost the game.